So last night I was invited to speak at the Liberal Democrats Queensland monthly party meeting, and I was asked if they could live stream the talk on the LDP Queensland Facebook page. What I didn't know is they do their live streams with a handheld mobile phone, so consequently it's not the best quality audio, and at about the 3-minute 45 mark, approximately 30 seconds of footage is completely missing. After that initial few minutes, the quality gets a little better, but it's still a bit of a struggle, so you'll need a little bit of patience and tolerance for this one, but hopefully you'll get something out of it. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Connor Court Bookrooms, whose premises we used for the occasion. They have a great selection of books. I picked up a copy of Brendan O'Neill's new book, Anti-Woke, so check them out if you're in or around Boundary Street in the West End of Brisbane.
Where are you going?
Yep, good to go.
No introduction. So this talk was advertised as about toxic masculinity. That's false advertising. It's about toxic masculinity and fragile femininity. And I'm going to make the case that actually fragile femininity is a bigger problem than toxic masculinity. So, last one, January. The American Psychological Association declared that traditional masculinity, marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance and aggression, is on the whole harmful. Men socialised in this way, say the APA, are less likely to engage in healthy behaviours. Now, hot on the heels of this proclamation was a public service announcement masquerading as an advertisement from Gillette. You may have seen that the best a man can be amounts to making women feel more comfortable. This is in stark contrast to at least 3 female positive ads by the same Australian feminist director, Kim Garrick, including such inspiring campaigns as Viva la Vulva, urging women to celebrate their sexual organs. Now, in the subsequent weeks and after much criticism, the APA has felt the need to modify their statement that it's, quote, only extreme stereotypical behaviours and not being a traditional male that may result in negative outcomes. And the Gillette ad has garnered about double the number of dislikes to likes. But of course, in the world of social justice, this denial is just confirmation of the intransigent nature of toxic masculinity. Now, both the APA pronouncement and the Gillette public service announcement reflect, I think, a broader cultural zeitgeist. There's actually something inherently wrong with men, something toxic about being male. And it's easy to come to that conclusion when you focus solely on the negative outcomes of extreme, predominantly male behaviour. But what I don't want to do now is just list off all the positive outcomes of predominantly male behaviour, because that's no different from what the toxic masculinity crowd does. So let's acknowledge that men are overrepresented in the worst behaviours in our society. So, for example, the Australian Institute of Criminology says that 88% of all homicides in the country are committed by men, and 2/3 of the victims are also men. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, men account for more than 70% of the perpetrators of all forms of violence, and account for about 50%. And isn't it wonderful to say former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull? He says that he went on national TV and said that domestic violence is just violence against women. And you may have noticed that the domestic violence industrial complex doesn't actually talk about domestic violence anymore. They talk about violence against women. Our Watch, which received $6 million in funding from the Australian government last year, has as its stated purpose on its website, quote, to end violence against women and their children. So their stated aim is to end violence against those that are on average less likely to experience it. And I would like to point out that to our Watch that women's children are also men's children. I'm actually thinking of sending them a Venn diagram.
Explain it.
I'm afraid it would go over their heads. If you take a look at every government-funded commercial about domestic violence, you've probably seen them. The Stop It at the Start campaign was launched in 2016. There's been others. 100% of the perpetrators in those ads are white males. 100% of the victims are females, which is strange given their obsession with equal representation. This asymmetry between the reality and the public perception and public policy is a phenomenon I like to call meteor strikes Earth, women most affected. And probably my favourite example is when Hillary Clinton, as First Lady, claimed at a domestic violence conference that women have always been the primary victims of war. Apparently the hundreds of thousands of men that died in the swamps of Passchendaele were merely secondary victims of war. I'll take a more recent example. Four Corners ran a program in late February titled, "Why Are So Many Women Going to Jail?" It turns out a lot of women that end up in jail had histories of abuse, experienced personal tragedy, which led them to drugs, alcohol, drug dealing, theft, robbery, and violence, the usual chain of events. Now, I don't know what prompted this investigation, but perhaps it was a revelation last year that from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics that between 2011 and 2017, the number of women incarcerated for violent crimes in New South Wales increased by 50%. Although, strangely, I can't remember the investigation into the 92% of the prison population that is male and the underlying factors that drive male offenders, for example, an absence of male parental figures. But I digress. The statistics from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics prompted two Sydney-based feminists to argue it's because of sexist cops and judges. They complained that cops and judges needed to be more merciful when sentencing women because women suffer more in prison. Yeah, they actually said that. But remember, they're feminists, so they believe in equality. Or take a less pernicious phenomenon with no less hysteria attached to it, the scourge of online abuse directed at women, in particular female journalists, activists, politicians. In a report released last year, Amnesty International concluded that the violence and abuse many women experience on Twitter has a detrimental effect on their right to express themselves equally, freely, and without fear. Notice the concept creep of violence here. It applies to tweets. Now, when Amnesty International was asked by the very progressive NPR how do men's experiences compare, Amnesty International had to admit they didn't actually ask men. And this is not unintentional, because as we'll see later, asking both sexes about negative experiences yields some inconvenient results. Luckily, however, the Pew Research Organisation did ask both sexes in two large-scale surveys, first conducted in 2013, second one in 2016. The results were exactly the same. Men are more likely to experience online abuse. Of the 6 categories of abuse, men and women experience the same level of abuse in 3 of those categories. Men receive more abuse in 2 categories, name-calling and physical threats of violence. Women are more likely to be sexually harassed online. But the real difference is how upset men and women get about the abuse. So 38% of women found the experience very or extremely upsetting. Less than half that number of men said the same. With 64%, almost 2/3 of men found their experience to be a little or not upsetting at all, compared to only about a third of women. And this gets to the crux of the asymmetry. Women complain more about the same treatment, and our collective response as a society is to defer to the feelings of the most easily offended. And I think this is ultimately detrimental to women because it doesn't build resilience. In 2016, The Guardian documented which federal MPs received the most abuse on Twitter during the federal election. They compiled a list of the top 20 most abused MPs. Now, at the time, women constituted 27% of MPs, so if abuse were gender neutral, you'd expect about 5, maybe 6 women of that 20 to be in the top 20. Anyone want to have a guess at how many women were in that top 20? 2? 0. 2? 0? 0 would be correct. Not 1. But that was the first half of that article in The Guardian. The second half of the article talked about how much abuse Lee Sales got with her softball interview with Malcolm Turnbull. So this article, which started off talking about how the most abused MPs during the federal election, turned into an article about how awful Twitter is because Lee Sales got abused. That's how they finished the article. That was the conclusion. Twitter's awful for women. Also in 2016, 2 studies appeared about abuse of women. Specifically, they looked at the use of the words slut and whore on Twitter directed at women. Now, one study found that half the abuse came from other women. Then the other study said up to 60% of that abuse came from other women. And usually, in my experience, the only people who are surprised by these stats are men. Women are well aware of how they treat each other. I don't know if you want to make a comment on that as the only woman here. Back in September last year, a study from the US-based Workplace Bullying Institute, and yeah, that is a real institute, said that 58% of workplace bullies are women, and that 90% of that bullying perpetrated by women was directed at other women. This is known as the Queen Bee syndrome, that women in positions of power try to prevent other women from rising to the same level. So if you want to tackle workplace bullying against women, perhaps it's time for women to have some diversity training to address their unconscious bias to stop bullying each other. But I won't hold my breath for that government-funded study. And this, of course, is another tenet of female victimhood. It's when you're the bully, you're actually the victim. Take the case of Emma Hussar. Remember that one? 44 allegations of workplace bullying from 21 former and current staff. Now, one of those allegations, which we'll call the basic instinct allegation, has been categorically denied by all parties involved. And so, ignoring all the other allegations, Hussar goes on the ABC and whinges how her political career is over because of slut-shaming. But if that were true, wouldn't Sarah Hanson-Young's career be over? She's actually celebrated for that. The truth is, Emma Hussar is a horrible bully, but in the world of female victimhood, she's actually the victim. Just listen and believe. And while we're on the topic of politics, what of the revelations of Liberal Party women who were bullied during the leadership stoush last year? This was immediately picked up by the professional victims of the ABC, most notably Emma Alberici, who leapt on this story as proof of rampant sexism in politics, especially in the Liberal Party. And so self-absorbed by this victim narrative, not once did she stop to ask the question, are men subject to this type of bullying? And if they are, why aren't they whinging about it? Are women being singled out for this type of treatment? Or could it be that the women are complaining are either Turnbull loyalists or in seats which they most definitely will lose at the next election? No, you don't need to ask those questions. A woman has asserted a truth, so you need to listen and believe. But of course, we can't even establish that there was any bullying. There's yet to be a single specific claim at the time of the leadership spill in Canberra. We have some vague claims about people that were pressured to make a vote one way or the other. People came into other people's offices and they wouldn't leave until they had a signature. Now, if that's bullying, then the snowflakery that infests our university campuses has made its way to Canberra. I mean, if you don't like people pressuring you to vote or that won't leave your office when asked, the appropriate response is to tell them to piss off, not to go whinging and whining to the media. We learnt later that if there was any bullying, it happened at the state level, not in Canberra. But again, even this is a spurious claim. Anne Sood-Marlis, the member for the federal seat of Gilmore, claims that she was bullied by state MP Gareth Ward. And what this claim boils down to is that she's just not as good at branch stacking as Ward is. So she reached into a bag of tricks and played the Jimmy card, and she was rewarded with a secondment to the United Nations for 3 months, which I think she actually turned down. Now, I'm not suggesting that women need to shut up and put up with bad behaviour. I call out abuse when it's real and demonstrable, but it would be possible before allegations of bullying are thrown around, and we can at least discuss what types of behaviour actually constitute bullying. Could we not just take the word of the biggest snowflake and the most easily offended as the standard by which all our behaviour will be judged? But this has steamrolled now into a discussion about gender quotas for the Liberal Party. Labor has them. A lot of women are running around. Julie Bishop, who's never said a word about gender quotas ever, and now she's on the outs and realised how unpopular she is with her own party. She's jumped on the bandwagon. Julia Banks actually said that quotas are not demeaning to women, and nor will women be regarded as the quota girl. Now, I don't know where Julia Banks gets the arrogance to speak on behalf of all women, but perhaps it'd be worth asking a few who aren't as privileged as she is. And interestingly, on Rita Panahi's show in September last year, an uncorroborated claim was made that Labor Party women who get in on quotas are known amongst the members as quota queens. So I don't know if the Liberal Party wants to go down that route, but it appears that they are. You may have noticed the same people who make the argument about needing more women in Parliament are deathly silent on the need for more male primary school teachers, currently just 17% of the total. They're not interested in pushing for more female brickies labourers or sewage treatment plant workers. No, gender parity across occupational categories is only ever advocated for when it comes to well-paid, high-prestige jobs. The kind that the gender warriors themselves are interested in. And notice I said gender parity because despite the popular narrative, gender parity or 50-50 representation doesn't actually have anything to do with traditional notions of equality. The idea used to be that we wanted a level playing field where everyone had equal opportunity to pursue the types of careers they wanted. But now that we live in the United Soviet Socialist Republic of Australia, where quotas to improve female representation are the norm across the public sector and increasingly the private sector, there are quotas for the New South Wales Fire and Rescue Service, all state police departments, the Australian Defence Force, the Australian Federal Police. The film and TV industry is now in on the act, scrutinising the gender and ethnicity of every creative team that applies for film, television or documentary subsidies. Screen New South Wales introduced a new rule that all TV drama series must now include female key creatives on their team in order to receive development or production finance. Similar KPIs can be found in the Australian music industry. I received a letter last month from a former RAAF pilot. The Human Rights Commission, under the tutelage of resident nutbag Kate Jenkins, sought to address why no Australian female has ever graduated as a fighter pilot in the RAF. As a result, the return of service obligation for females is now 4.5 years as opposed to 10 years for males. There's a pilot entry stream created just for females only called the Graduate Pilot Scheme for Women, studying a Bachelor of Aviation at Griffith University. Under that scheme, after 1 year at uni, the RAAF pays all uni fees and a salary, and also pays for all flying done during the degree. And then once the female successfully graduates from the RAAF pilot's course, her minimum service obligation under this scheme is only 3 years, while the males graduating beside her, without the benefit of having everything paid for them, are locked in for another 10 years. So I'm going to quote from that letter now. The ironic aspect of this is that the RAAF claims the reduced return of service obligation is a female pilot retention measure, where all it really does is allow trained female pilots to leave the RAAF 3 years after having millions spent on it, because that's how much it costs to actually train. And what does this have to do with fragile femininity? Well, it demonstrates that women, not all women, but at least the women that advocate for gender preferences in hiring, think that women can't compete on a playing field, that they consistently need the playing field tilted in their favour to achieve gender parity. They will say gender equality. And this condescending view of women is shared by the Labor Party. Despite being 51% of the voting public, women apparently can't elect themselves into office. They need quotas. And this push for gender parity, disingenuously called gender equality, is tied back to violence against women. A Sydney Morning Herald article just before the announcement of the Australia Honours this year ludicrously claimed that, quote, "We can't fight the prolific problem of gendered violence in our society without making it normal to celebrate the heroic achievements of women just as much as men. Highlighting more women as role models will shift public perceptions and begin to end the gender stereotypes that disrespect women and cause them injury and death." So what you're being asked to believe is if we get more women Australia Day honours, and remember this is a voluntary system, there's no bias here, anyone in this room can elect someone for Australia Day honour, that if we get more women, then this is going to stop some unemployed drug addict in a Western Sydney housing estate from beating his girlfriend. And this is the logic. you know. And I think that all it's going to do is make men more sceptical of women's achievements. I mean, every woman's going to be suspect. I mean, how did you get here? Did you get in on a quota? Did you get in on preferential treatment? But if you think this is some sort of lunatic belief of a Sydney Morning Herald journalist, think again. I mean, this is now government policy. As many of you in this room will know, David Leyonhjelm has held Senate estimates hearings on exactly this claim, that disrespect and gender inequality leads to violence against women. And the evidence that the domestic violence industrial complex came up with completely contradicted their own claims. It turns out substance abuse, unemployment, poverty, a family history of abuse are greater predictors of violence than gender inequality and disrespect. I mean, who would have thought? I don't know if any of you saw Our Watch's new campaign they put out last year. I think it was in December or November. Our Watch has a new online ad campaign to call out disrespect of women when you see it. Anyone seen this? Yeah, a couple of people. So Our Watch gives you 5 convoluted scenarios in which you can call out a man for disrespecting a woman. This all happens in a restaurant setting. But in 3 of the 5 cases, it's men calling out men. It's not women just sort of sitting there like, you know, dummies. In one case, a woman rolls her eyes disapprovingly. And in the other one, a woman actually does say something. And going back to the Gillette ad, which we started with, it's, you know, it says that men can be their best by preventing their mates from chatting up women in the street and stopping other men from asking women to smile for the camera at parties. Because remember, women are strong and independent and don't need no man unless someone asks them to smile. Then they need a man to mansplain to another man that it's not okay to ask a woman to smile. See, mansplaining's okay when it's done to make women feel more comfortable. But let me offer another alternative. How about we encourage women to stand up for themselves? If they feel disrespected, call it out. Don't like being asked to smile? Say so. Tanveer Ahmed's book, Fragile Nation, he makes the case that we used to teach children resilience. Now we teach them that they're fragile, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is now what doesn't kill you actually makes you weaker. And I think the biggest losers in the push to see women as fragile, in the end, is young women. In a 2017 report released by Plan International called The Dream Gap, Australian girls' views on gender equality, they were asked various questions, and this was the conclusion. At all ages, in all spaces, girls don't think they are treated equally to boys. Between 96% and 98% of girls surveyed said boys and girls received unequal treatment, and 91% of girls said it would be easier to get ahead if they were treated the same as boys. Now, I don't blame teenage girls feeling this way. They're fed a constant diet of female victimhood. But if we could put aside the feelings of teenage girls for a minute, maybe we could examine a few facts. If you're a girl today, you're more likely to do well at school. You're less likely to be considered a disciplinary problem. You're less likely to be on behaviour-modifying drugs. You're less likely to have a substance abuse problem. You're less likely to have a learning difficulty. You're less likely to commit suicide. You're more likely to go to university. And there are a multitude of government-funded programs to get girls into coding or engineering, and very little for boys. And even if you don't go to university, the unemployment rate for females aged 15 to 24 is about 2.5 percentage points lower than boys at the same age. Girls are knocking it out of the park, but they feel like they're being treated unequally. And so the culture of feelings over facts prevails. One area where girls are falling down is apparently the skyrocketing levels of anxiety and depression amongst young girls. And I wonder if being told you're a victim of the patriarchy every 5 minutes has something to do with it. The cult of female victimhood and the portrayal of women as passive victims with no agency will eventually, inevitably, lead to a generation of fragile women. I think we're already seeing some of that. And I think if we can recognise the need to address the worst manifestations of male behaviour, perhaps we can also encourage women to be more mentally resilient. But rather than me mansplaining what a resilient woman sounds like, let me channel the words of Liberal Senator Amanda Stoker speaking at last year's Liberty First conference in Brisbane. She was speaking in reference to the bullying controversy around the leadership challenge. She said, "I find it paternalistic, pathetic, that women whose job is to be able to represent people in the community, and oftentimes people who are doing it tough, then turn around and say they can't speak up for themselves in a private conversation. The idea that there needs to be different treatment for women is just the strangest thing, and the fact that it's rising makes it all the more bizarre." Bizarre indeed. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any questions for stuff?
How do you think that schools impact how this sort of victim culture continues?
Yeah, I don't know. The schools are pushing the same line, but I don't think it comes from the schools. So you've got a lot of the, for example, white ribbon is in the schools now running around with, I don't know if you've heard about this, in New South Wales they're running around making boys stand up in the class and make a pledge to respect women while the girls sit down. This is part of, someone mentioned Safe Schools, this is part of Respectful Relationships, which is the next iteration of Safe Schools. A lot of it's being pushed by the advocacy groups, I think. So it's not, and I think, the teachers, I'm not saying the teachers aren't complicit, but I think they're just echoing what they're being spoon-fed from the advocacy groups. If you look into any of this stuff, the surveys they use are completely biased. I remember that part I talked about, the Pew survey about online abuse, and they asked men and women. So what the advocacy groups generally do when they ask about things about respecting women, they ask both boys and girls' attitudes towards respecting women. They don't ask about men. They don't ask the reverse. Why? Well, we know why. Because actually both girls and boys think that disrespect of boys is more tolerable than the other way around. So they just don't ask that. You don't get the stats and you don't see it. There was a large-scale study in 2001 done on 5,000 young adults and teens from the ages of 12 to 20, and they did ask both. And they asked them both. And they asked them questions that was specifically about violence. They asked them, questions were like, is it okay to hit your girlfriend if she makes fun of you in front of your mates? And all these questions went down in gradation, so it got worse, the offence. And at the bottom one was, is it okay to hit your girlfriend if she throws something at you? And they also had the complete reverse. Is it okay to hit your boyfriend if he makes fun of you, throws something at you? In every single case, both girls and boys agree, young adults, that it's more okay to hit men than it is women. I mean, this is not surprising, I think, to people in this room to hear this. I mean, at least my generation and older were brought up, you don't hit women, you don't even talk a certain way in front of your mother, different language, different treatment. But you're not told this because it's inconvenient to the narrative. The narrative is women are under assault from men, primarily, and we just ignore the other stuff.
Yes, that's a question. What's your opinion on the rise of the manosphere, and do you think that the treatment of boys and men in Australia is helping to fuel the popularity of the manosphere in Australia today?
Yeah, the answer, I think, is quite clearly yes. The last part.
Manosphere? The manosphere is basically the online community of the men's rights advocates.
It's a huge sort of web of anything from MGTOW, maybe another thing you haven't heard of, men going their own way, red pill channels. Manosphere refers to the whole complex of these different interlocking groups, I suppose.
Okay.
Where else are you going to go? Why do you think Jordan Peterson's so popular? Because his message is not aimed at men or young boys, but that's who's grabbing onto it. Because where else are they getting the message to do something purposeful with your life and take responsibility? They're not. They're getting fed a constant diet of You must respect women. You must step out of the way. Let women be their ally. Lead in. You know all this terminology. Yeah? No one's actually telling them what they should be doing, or to go out and seize the day. So, yeah, it's and you can already see there are. It should be clear there are aspects of the manosphere that are toxic. There are the equivalent of the man-hating feminist. There is that element in the manosphere as well, on the other end of the spectrum. That's pretty awful. But you can see the demonisation of this manosphere already. You know, they're already starting to make comparisons. For example, this is the kind of stuff that drives people to do mass shootings. You know. But there's some positive stuff in there. There's some negative stuff in there. But yeah, absolutely.
So, is there anything that you think men can actually do to solve the problem of female fragility? Because it's quite hard to find a non-fragile female these days.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, one of the problems I think is, I mean, because this is not just a problem of women being fragile. It's men consistently allowing, this treatment. Like, I'm talking here now about our politicians that are, in their 50s and 60s, constantly going along with these talking points. Like Scott Morrison is no different than Tony. Scott Morrison goes on national TV and validates the bogus statistic of the wage gap. He came out and said the wage gap's the lowest it's ever been under the Liberal Party. The wage gap doesn't tell you anything. I mean, it's a context-free statistic that tells you nothing about the state of pay between men and women. It doesn't take into account any of the factors that would actually let you make that decision. Get back to you to answer the question. A lot of men have to stop being pussies. Men have to stop catering to every female whinge and whine and actually call out and just say, you're just whinging. That's what I think. This is hard. Yeah, I mean, you're a young bloke, there's a lot of young blokes in this room. One of your first thoughts is probably, how do I get laid and what do I have to say? Hoops do I have to jump through? Well, if you're going to be honest and direct and not treat them like snowflakes, you're going to talk yourself out of some sex probably. But that's the hard pill you've got to swallow. Sorry. Easy for me to say. I don't play in that pond anymore.
Great. I'm not sure how to word this, mull it over my head, but are we expecting men should be equal?
No, I think if you mean the ideologues pushing this stuff, I think they're expecting men and
women. What the presupposition is from our side and their side, what is the real...
Well, here's my presupposition, is that outcomes will be what they will be. Let them be. The other side is trying to manufacture an equality of outcome through policy, gender
Because
quotas.
presumably her presupposition is we are both the same,
Exactly.
therefore the same result.
Call it blank slatism. So the assumption is that because we're identical, and the only thing that is different is sort of societal expectations, gender stereotypes, that actually all outcomes should be equal. Now, there should be 50% female politicians and 50% female engineers, and the fact that there isn't, it must be discrimination. It's never discrimination the other way. Like, there's no discrimination in the teaching industry. The brickies labourers, they must be really sexist pricks, because I've never seen one woman working as a brickies labourer, but they're not actually worried about those occupations, and that's where you see the hypocrisy of this. Because what do they ever advocate for, where they want equal outcomes across occupational categories? Politics, STEM fields, anything that pays well in a cushy office.
Boards of directors.
Boards of directors, executives, CEOs. I mean,
Pretty much any government.
High death rate.
yeah,
Exactly like it
Yes.
is. Men are overrepresented in high death rate jobs.
94% of workplace deaths are men. No one's calling for equality in that. Like I said, 92% of prisoners are men. And they're already whinging that there's an increasing number of women going to jail. And this is all, it goes back to the meteor strikes Earth women most affected. Like, there's been a spate of articles in the last few years about how the growing number of homeless women in their 50s and 60s. They didn't get careers, they got married, they got divorced, they got nothing. But no one ever mentions that I think it's 2/3 of the homeless are men. But again, meteor strikes Earth, women most affected. Yeah, but that's the difference in the assumptions. I believe, and I think probably I don't want to speak for you, but there are some innate differences between men and women, and culture and society plays, and those two things operate on one another. But their assumption is we are blank slates, we're exactly the same, and if we can remove all these gender stereotypes and things, and we will naturally just be 50-50. And it's really, I think what the real irony of this is that these people say that it's all done under the guise of diversity. They're actually against diversity. They don't like natural diversity. They want, anyone ever heard Billy Connolly talk about the beige people? They want everybody to be the same. They don't like diversity at all. They don't like natural diversity. They hate that outcomes aren't equal. Yeah, it's odd.
This is probably more of a comment than anything, but that Jordan Steele John, or whatever his name is, dickhead in the wheelchair.
Yes.
From the Greens. If ever I've seen a toxic male, he is. I saw him being interviewed on the ABC by, I think, Lee Sales, and the disrespect that he actually showed her was phenomenal. You know, he never looked at her. He rolled his eyes at the questions and you know, and all that sort of stuff. And I just thought, well, if you ever want to see what a toxic male is, just look at him. He's a classic example of it. He's a bully. He's a bully. You can, you know, he just loves to, you know, just.
He's 24 years of age. 24 years of age.
Something like that,
And he came out yesterday, and we saw it, and said that these politicians who have no experience of what it's like to be, you know, basically said they had no life experience.
Yeah.
He's 24 years of age. And I think the strange thing about that is that because we're so now focused on the victim, but my feeling is that someone like that is probably the least equipped to talk about those issues because they're too close to it. It's like asking someone who's an anti-vaxxer because they know someone's kid died after they had a vaccination shot, even though that's correlation, not causation. And you can't talk that parent out of thinking that because that's what happened. I just think, I don't know why we pay so much attention to these people. Why are we paying attention to 15-year-old kids in Canberra talking about climate change? Shut the hell up and get back to school. You don't know anything. Does anyone in this room remember what it's like to be 15? I mean, you're an idiot.
There's a saying in family business that when I was 15, I couldn't work out why Dad was so friggin' dumb. Now I'm 30, shit, he's become intelligent.
Do you have a theory as to why all of this is happening on a fundamental level?
It's probably too long of a conversation for this. That
How about over a beer?
Is it pub time?
that sounds like it's pub time.
Excellent.